Howard Caldwell stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass on the 38th floor of the building that bore his name, a white porcelain cup cooling in his hand. Below, Seattle spread wide and indifferent. On the table behind him, 3 white envelopes, $50 each. Nothing more. He had locked their cards at midnight, changed the gate code at 5 in the morning, left no note, no explanation, only the envelopes, and 7 days of silence. 3 sons, 3 directions. None of them understood yet what this week would actually cost them, and it had nothing to do with money. Howard had rebuilt everything his father destroyed. He knew what an empty refrigerator felt like at 2 in the morning. What he didn't know, what kept him awake the night before, was whether any of his sons had ever been desperate enough to find out. Only one of them was. Howard Caldwell had spent the better part of 30 years making decisions that other men spent weeks deliberating. He signed contracts over breakfast. He read people the way seasoned forecasters read weather, not by what they said, but by what they held back. At 59, he had built Caldwell Property Group from a single rental property on the outskirts of Portland into a real estate empire worth $1.4 billion. And he had done it the only way he knew how, by understanding very early what it cost to have nothing. His grandfather, Walter Caldwell, had understood the same thing. Walter had built a small construction company from near-zero capital buying land, before land had value working with hands that never fully lost their calluses, even after the money came. Howard's father inherited all of it and spent a decade dissolving it. Bad decisions compounded by worse habits, debt accumulating in silence, until the silence itself became the loudest thing in the house. Howard had been 23 when the last of it collapsed. He remembered standing in the kitchen of the house that was no longer theirs, looking at his father sitting at the table, with nothing to sign and nowhere to go, and deciding not dramatically, not with any particular resolve, just quietly and completely, that he would never arrive at that table. He never did. But he also never forgot what the table looked like. His wife Caroline had understood him in the way that only a few people ever understand another person, not by explaining them, but by standing beside them without needing to. She died when Leo was 8 years old. Howard raised all 3 boys alone, did not remarry, and told himself for years that the work was enough, that being present was enough, that the house and the accounts and the absence of want constituted a kind of love. He had been watching his sons for months before the Sunday in March when he made up his mind. Connor was 27. He held the title of Deputy Director at Caldwell Property Group, a title Howard had given him 3 years earlier, which Connor wore the way certain men wear expensive watches, as proof of arrival rather than evidence of work. He showed up to family dinners on time but never looked up from his phone. He answered questions in half sentences. He moved through rooms the way people move through rooms when they believe their presence is in itself a contribution. Brett was 24 and had been building a startup for 2 years. The company had a name, a logo, a website, and an Instagram following of 5,000 people. It had no revenue and no product. The monthly transfers Howard sent, which Brett referred to as a seed funding, had become as automatic as the utility bills, and Brett had come to treat them the same way as infrastructure, invisible until it failed. Leo was 21. He had graduated 4 months earlier and taken a position at a small nonprofit in East Seattle for $32,000 a year. Howard had offered him a role at Caldwell Property Group 3 times. Leo declined each time without explanation. He ate dinner, carried his own plate to the kitchen, washed his hands, dried them, and put the dish towel back, a habit from when he was 13, unasked and unremarked upon. Howard had noticed it every time. He had said nothing. On a Sunday evening after dinner, Howard called all 3 of them into the study. Not the conference room at the office, but the room at home with the old wooden desk his grandfather had used, and the narrow top drawer that held a gold-plated pocket watch that had not run in 12 years. 3 white envelopes sat on the desk when they walked in. Howard did not give a speech. He said, "There's $50 in each envelope. That's everything you have for 7 days starting at 6 a.m. Monday. No bank cards, no borrowing from friends, no coming back here. Your phones are for emergencies only. Your cars stay in the garage. You leave with what you're carrying." Connor looked at the envelopes and smiled the particular smile of a man who has never had to take anything completely seriously because nothing has ever required it of him. Brett picked his envelope up and turned it over in his hands, the way he evaluated most things, searching for the angle, the upside, the percentage. "You're not serious," he said. It was not quite a question. Leo looked at his father's face first. He did not look at the envelope. He studied Howard's expression the way you study a contract, before signing, not for what it said, but for whether the person who wrote it meant it. Then he reached out, picked up the envelope, and felt the slight, honest weight of $50 in cash. He nodded once. 6 a.m. Howard had spoken to the bank the week before. He had already arranged a personal leave notice for Connor's office. He had changed the gate code at 5 o'clock that morning. This was not a spontaneous gesture. It was 3 months of watching 3 weeks of planning, and 1 Sunday evening of certainty that everything was ready. The boys had no real choice about whether to accept. The envelopes were a statement of fact, not an invitation. The only actual choice, the one that would define the week, and possibly more than the week, was who each of them would be once the Caldwell name stopped opening doors. Monday came gray and cold, the way Seattle mornings come in March. At 6 o'clock, the gate clicked shut behind 3 men who had spent their entire lives inside a particular kind of safety, and were now standing outside it, each holding $50 each, carrying whatever 20-some years of that life had quietly made them into. Howard watched from the window as the 3 figures moved away in separate directions. He set down his coffee cup. He did not check his phone. He had asked a question 3 months ago, not out loud, not to anyone, and now the question was walking down the street, and he would have his answer in 7 days, or he would have something harder than an answer. He was prepared for either. Connor Caldwell had never taken a taxi that cost $14, and felt it. He had taken taxis across cities, to airports through rainstorms, and the money had always been noise background static that his card absorbed without ceremony. But standing at the front desk of the Seattle Marriott downtown on Monday morning, watching the clerk's face shift from professional courtesy to the particular blankness that precedes an awkward conversation, he felt $14 for the first time in his life. The card was declined, then declined again. The clerk suggested he try a different card. He did not have a different card. He stepped away from the desk with his leather suitcase and stood near the entrance watching the revolving door spin for other people, and understood slowly the way understanding arrives when your body knows before your mind admits it that his last name was not in his wallet. He called his college friend Scott, who had a 1-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill, and enough decency to say yes without asking too many questions. By noon, Connor was sitting in a living room that smelled like old carpet and takeout containers, his suitcase propped against the wall next to a secondhand bookshelf. He went out for lunch out of habit. More than hunger, ordered a burger and water at a place on Broadway, tipped reflexively, and walked back with $17 in his pocket. It did not occur to him to do the math. Not yet. Brett left the house at exactly 6 o'clock with a backpack and a framework he'd already built in his head. $50 was starting capital, and starting capital was meant to be deployed. By 8:30, he had found a startup and networking event at a co-working space in South Lake Union, $35 entry fee, listed online as an investment in your professional network. He paid without hesitation. That was what entrepreneurs did. They invested. 3 hours later, he walked out into the afternoon with $15, 8 business cards from people whose names he was already struggling to remember, and no place to sleep that night. The event had offered him nothing except the particular exhaustion that comes from performing confidence to strangers who are simultaneously performing the same thing back at you. He stood on the sidewalk outside the co-working space and calculated for the first time all day that $15 did not cover a bed anywhere in Seattle. Leo had left the house at 5:45, 15 minutes before he was required to. He walked. The morning air came off the sound, cold and damp, carrying the smell of low tide and wet concrete. He did not call a car. He walked the way people walk when they are trying to understand something about the terrain before committing to it. He found the public library on 4th Avenue when it opened. He chose a table near the window, good light, clear sight lines, and opened a black composition notebook he'd carried in his jacket pocket. On the first page, he wrote $50 divided by 7 days equals $7.14 per day. He drew 3 columns: food, water, shelter. He looked at the word shelter for a long moment, then drew a line through it and wrote, beside it, find free. At a Dollar General 4 blocks away, he bought a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a reusable water bottle for $8.50. He ate 2 slices of bread, standing on the sidewalk, watching the city move around him, then walked back to the library and recorded the expenditure to the penny. He had $41.50, 6.5 days. The numbers were workable. By Tuesday night, the 3 of them were in different kinds of trouble. Connor had spent Wednesday morning at Kerry Park, the viewpoint where Seattle postcards were taken, where tourists stood and photographed the skyline and Mount Rainier on clear days. He sat on a bench with his leather suitcase beside him and worked through his contact list, the way you work through a checklist you already know will fail. A business associate voicemail, a client he'd had dinner with twice unavailable this week, a woman he'd dated briefly the previous year, Paige, who picked up on the 3rd call and listened as he explained the situation. "So your dad actually cut everything," Paige said, not unkindly, like permanently. She was asking a reasonable question. The problem was that Connor didn't know the answer, and the deeper problem, which arrived in the middle of that phone call and did not leave, was that he could not in that moment name a single person in his contact list who was connected to him rather than to his father's company. The relationships had always felt like his. Standing outside them now, he could see they were not. Scott called Wednesday evening. His tone was still friendly, but the message was plain. A former roommate was moving back at the end of the week, and space was going to be tight. Connor heard it clearly. He had $17 no place confirmed after Friday, and for the first time in 27 years, no reliable next step. Brett slept on a bench near a bus stop on Pine Street that Tuesday night. He had spent the remaining $15 over 2 days on food and a failed attempt at a hostel bed that cost more than he had. Wednesday, he was down to nothing. He made one decision and unmade it several times before accepting it. He used the last of the coins he found in his jacket lining to buy 12 bottles of water at a corner market and spent Wednesday afternoon selling them individually on Pike Street. The sun appeared briefly, the way Seattle sun appears in March, tentative, almost apologetic. And he stood in it with his water bottles arranged on the ledge beside him and waited. Most people walked past without looking. The ones who looked did not stop. In 2.5 hours, he sold 5 bottles. His actual profit was $5.50. His feet hurt. His jacket was damp from the morning's rain. He understood in a way that 2 years of calling himself an entrepreneur had not managed to teach him the precise distance between having a business idea and standing on a sidewalk, hoping a stranger needed water. A woman stopped. She was around 65, wearing a canvas jacket and orthopedic shoes, and she bought 1 bottle and opened it and drank from it standing right there, which nobody else had done. She looked at Brett the way experienced people look at situations they've seen before, not with judgment, but with recognition. "Are you making money?" she said. "Or proving something?" She didn't wait for an answer. She took a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket, wrote on it, and set it next to his remaining water bottles. The paper had a name, Margaret Holt, and an address, Holt's Alterations and Laundry Pike Street. $11 an hour cash starting at 8 in the morning if he wanted it. Then she picked up her bag and walked. Brett looked at the paper for a long time after she left. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket and kept standing there in the late afternoon with the rest of his water bottles, the sky going gray again, the way it always eventually did. Leo found the church kitchen on the west side on Tuesday evening, a small operation that served dinner 3 nights a week to anyone who walked in. He sat across from a man he had not met before, a man in his early 60s, wearing a blue flannel shirt with fold lines still visible along the sleeves, the kind of fold lines that meant the shirt had been stored carefully and worn deliberately. The man ate slowly, cutting everything into small pieces with plastic cutlery in a way that suggested he hadn't forgotten how to sit at a real table, even when the table was a folding one in a church basement. Leo didn't ask about his circumstances. He asked about the shirt. The man's name was Arthur Webb. He had been an electrician for 28 years. His wife Sandra had died in 2020 from pancreatic cancer. The insurance had covered part of it, the smaller part as it turned out. The rest had moved through his life in a sequence that Arthur described without self-pity. The way you describe weather, the medical bills first, then the tools, then the truck, then the house in Tacoma, where he'd been 3 years from paying off the mortgage. He said, "One morning you wake up and you've become the person you used to step around on the street." Leo listened without filling the ends of sentences, without rushing toward the meaning before it arrived on its own. When they finished eating, Leo wrote 4 words in his notebook. Measure twice. Cut once. Thursday arrived harder. Brett woke on the bench again, stomach empty with nothing in his pockets, and the address of Holt's Alterations and Laundry 4 blocks east. He lay there looking at the low Seattle sky and did not move. Brett Caldwell did not fold other people's laundry for $11 an hour. That was what he told himself. He knew even as he thought it that he was choosing wrong. He would remember the precise shape of that moment for a long time. The specific quality of choosing badly on purpose, fully aware in the cold gray of a Thursday morning. Connor called his father 3 times that afternoon. Voicemail, voicemail, voicemail. He called back a 4th time and left a message with a voice stripped of every register he normally used. No ease, no authority, no performance of being fine. "Dad, this isn't funny anymore. I can't. I need." The sentence did not finish. He held the phone after he hung up and realized he didn't know what came after. "I need," because he had never had to complete that sentence before anything arrived to complete it for him. Leo spent $11 on generic brand ibuprofen, 200 tablets, and brought them back to Arthur, who had mentioned his back in passing, the way people mention chronic pain briefly, and then passed it. He waited while Arthur took 2 with water and sat quietly until the older man's posture eased slightly. Then Leo walked to a hardware store on Delridge Way and spent $9 on a small piece of poplar wood sandpaper and wood glue. He brought it back to the church steps and set it in front of Arthur without explanation. "You said you were an electrician," Leo said, "but you fix woodwork too." "I could tell. Show me something." What Arthur Webb made in the next 2 hours on the front steps of that church was a small box. Sliding lid. Flat edges, square corners. He worked slowly and without wasted motion, the economy of someone who had spent decades learning that speed is not the same as efficiency. When it was finished, he turned it over and used an old key from his keychain to scratch 2 letters into the bottom of the wood. "Double." He set it on the step and looked at it for a moment. It was the first thing he had made in more than 2 years. That night, each of the 3 was at his lowest point in his own way. Connor sat in Kerry Park as the light died over the water, his leather suitcase with a thin coat of dust on the brass clasp, $17 in his pocket, and no answer to the question of where he was sleeping tomorrow. He had spent 27 years inside a life that moved for him, and now the life had stopped moving, and he was standing in it completely still, not knowing which direction to walk. Brett lay on the bench with nothing in his stomach and nothing in his pockets, and the knowledge that a door had been opened for him, and he had spent a full day on a bench rather than walk through it because of what he thought walking through it would mean about who he was. The word for this was pride, and he had always thought of pride as a quality. He was beginning to understand it could be a wall. Leo lay on a cot in the church that night and looked at the ceiling. He had spent almost everything he had, and most of it on another person. And somewhere in the dark, he arrived at a thought that had not been available to him. Before this week, surviving was not the point. Surviving was the floor. The real question, the one he hadn't known his father was asking until right now, was whether 7 days could show you something about yourself that 21 years of comfort had kept carefully out of view. He thought it could. Friday morning, Connor walked into the public library on 4th Avenue. He did not know that Leo had sat at the same table near the same window 4 days earlier. He did not know this because the brothers had not spoken all week, each of them too occupied with the specific gravity of his own situation to think about the others. Connor chose the table near the window because it had good light, and he sat down and did not open his phone and did not pretend to read. His leather suitcase stood upright beside his chair, its brass clasp carrying a full coat of dust, still perfectly structured, still completely useless. People moved around him, students with laptops, an older man with a stack of large print novels, a woman managing 2 small children, and a canvas bag full of picture books. Connor watched them without absorbing them. He had $17 and no confirmed place to sleep that night, and no one left in his contact list he hadn't already tried. He sat for more than 2 hours. Near the end of the first hour, a boy, maybe 9 or 10, dropped a large hardcover book from the table beside Connor's. It landed with a flat crack on the tile floor. The boy's mother was occupied with a younger child across the table and didn't notice. Connor bent down and picked it up before he thought about it. Set it back on the table in front of the boy. The boy said, "Thank you," in the automatic way of children who have been taught to say, "Thank you." Connor nodded. Neither of them said anything else. It was not a significant exchange. It would not appear in any account of what changed for Connor Caldwell that week. But his hand had reached out towards someone else's problem without calculating whether there was anything in it for him, and that reflects so ordinary in most people, so long dormant in him, landed somewhere he hadn't expected. He sat for another hour after that, and what happened in that second hour was not dramatic and did not feel significant while it was occurring. Connor Caldwell existed in a room as exactly who he was, not the deputy director of anything, not the eldest son of Howard Caldwell, not a person whose name functioned as a key. He was a 27-year-old man in a library with $17, and the world was moving around him at its ordinary pace, entirely indifferent to what floor his office was on. At some point during the second hour, something in his posture changed. A loosening, a settling. He did not arrive at an answer. But the question, the real one beneath all the practical problems of the week, finally became audible. He had spent 27 years being the person the Caldwell name suggested he was. He had no idea whether that person and the one sitting in this chair were the same. He suspected they were not. He got up at noon, picked up his suitcase, and walked out into the gray afternoon with more intention than he had moved all week. Brett stood outside Holt's Alterations and Laundry for 5 minutes before he went in. He stood on the sidewalk and looked through the glass at the machines from the 1990s and the cracked tile floor and the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead and the hand-lettered sign on the wall. Clothes left more than 1 hour will be folded and shelved. Please respect others. He had the address memorized by now. He had spent Thursday on a park bench with nothing and a bad decision solidifying into a bad day, and Friday morning his legs had started moving east before the rest of him had formally agreed to it. He pushed the door open. Margaret Holt was behind the counter rolling coins into paper sleeves with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this particular task for decades. She looked up when the bell above the door rang. She looked at Brett, and then she looked back down at her coins. She did not say anything about the 2 days that had passed since she left her address on Pike Street. She pointed at a pile of clean laundry on the sorting table. "Start there." Brett started there. What happened over the next several hours was not interesting in any way that a 24-year-old who had spent 2 years calling himself an entrepreneur could have predicted. He folded shirts, he matched socks, he sorted items by claim ticket number and placed them in the correct slots on the shelving unit behind the counter. A woman came in with a broken zipper on a coat, and Margaret fixed it in 11 minutes, while Brett watched and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. An elderly man left a bag of dress shirts, and Margaret took his ticket without needing to write anything down because she already knew his name and his preferences, that he needed the collars starched but not stiff, a distinction she held in her head, along with dozens of similar distinctions for dozens of similar customers. At some point in the afternoon, Brett folded a pair of work pants, heavy canvas worn at the knees, laundered carefully, and he thought about whose pants these were and what kind of week that person had had. They wouldn't notice who folded them. They would just pick up their pants and go back to work. The work was invisible in the way that most necessary work is invisible, and it had been getting done every day for 35 years by a woman who opened her doors at 6 in the morning because that was when people needed them open, and who had written a stranger's address on a piece of paper without asking for anything in return. At 5 o'clock, Margaret set $11 on the counter in front of him, a 5 and 6 ones smoothed flat. Brett picked up the bills, folded them once, and put them in his pocket. "Same time tomorrow," he said. Margaret looked at him the way she had on Pike Street, not evaluating, just registering. "6 a.m., she said. "Door opens whether you're here or not." He was there at 5:50 on Saturday and Sunday. By the time Monday came, he had worked parts of 3 days, folding, sorting, running the front counter, when Margaret's knees slowed her down, and had kept his food costs to near nothing by eating whatever Margaret quietly left on the counter around noon, without announcing it as an act of generosity. He had earned just over $60 and spent a few dollars on food, leaving him with $58 to bring home. Sunday morning, Leo and Arthur Webb sat on the front steps of the church with $2 cups of coffee from the corner store, watching West Seattle wake up. A March wind moved down the street, damp and cold. A dog with no collar trotted past with somewhere to be. A city bus stopped at the corner, opened its doors, waited closed. Its doors left. Leo had $2.50 remaining. He wrote the number in his notebook and closed it. They did not talk much. Arthur drank his coffee with both hands wrapped around the cup, and Leo did the same, and the quiet between them was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. After a while, Arthur mentioned he had been a decent fisherman before everything a spot near Tacoma. He'd gone to every September for 15 years, with Sandra always caught more than they could eat, always gave the rest away. He said this not as something lost, but as something that had happened, a fact, evidence of a life that had been full and was now different, not erased. When they finished their coffee, Leo opened his notebook to a blank page and began to draw. Monday at 6 a.m., Howard opened the gate. Connor arrived at 9:30. He came through the front door with his leather suitcase, one side now visibly scratched from being set down on pavement, the brass clasp dull. His Oxford shoes had lost their polish. He did not look at his father when he came in. He walked straight upstairs and closed his bedroom door. Howard stood at the bottom of the staircase and listened to the sound of water running. 3 days without a real shower was not merely a hygiene problem. It was a weight, and the water was the first honest comfort his son had allowed himself since the gate closed. Howard went to the kitchen and put on more coffee. Brett came through the back door at 10:45. He set 2 things on the kitchen table before he said anything. The first was a stack of folded cash, a mix of tens, fives, and ones totaling $58, more than he'd started with. The second was a piece of torn paper with a name and address on it: Margaret Holt Holtz, Alterations, and Laundry Pike Street. Brett's hands rested open on the table in a way Howard noticed immediately, not clenched in his jacket pockets, the way they usually were, not moving to his phone. Open palms slightly up. "I want to go back Tuesday," Brett said. "To the laundry. Is that okay?" Howard looked at the money. He looked at the address. He looked at his son's hands. In 24 years, Brett had announced things, assumed things, requested things, as though approval were a formality. This was the first time a question had contained a real question mark, the first time he had asked something in a way that genuinely included the possibility of no, and was asking anyway. Howard said yes. Leo arrived at 2:20 in the afternoon. He came in quietly, set his jacket on the hook by the door, and placed two things on the kitchen table. The first was a small pile of coins, $2.50, arranged into a neat stack. The second was the black composition notebook open to the first page. Howard sat down and read it. He read the budget on the first page: $50 divided by 7 3-columns. The word shelter crossed out with a single line. He read every expense recorded to the penny over 7 days. He read the lines that were not numbers: measure twice, cut once, further in. He didn't need wood. He needed to be asked. The final page had one word underlined once enough. Howard closed the notebook. He sat with it under his hand for a long moment. Then he reached into the side drawer of the old kitchen table Walter Caldwell's table brought from the study and took out the gold pocket watch. Scratched case, fogged crystal, stopped for 12 years. He set it beside the notebook. Leo looked at the watch and did not reach for it. He seemed to understand that it was not being given yet. It was being placed beside something to see whether the two things belonged together. They did. Howard drove all 3 of them to Rainier Valley the next morning, without telling them where they were going. The 3 brothers sat in the back seat, with their shoulders nearly touching, the first time in years they had occupied that particular closeness. None of them spoke. Each one was still carrying the week somewhere in his body, still returning to himself from whatever version of himself 7 days had required. The lot was nearly half an acre. Chain-link fence on 3 sides, a crumbling brick wall on the 4th. Weeds pushing through broken concrete. A sign on the fence in blue letters on white future site of Caldwell Community Workshop and Transitional Housing. Howard got out of the car. His sons followed. He told them he had purchased this property 2 years ago and had told no one, not his board, not his attorneys, not any of his children. He told them what the building was going to be: a ground floor of workshop space, divided by trade, electrical carpentry, plumbing, basic mechanics for people coming out of transitional housing who needed to learn something with their hands. Above that, 38 low-income apartments, rents fixed below market rate permanently, not subject to the logic of the surrounding neighborhood's rising value. The building would not make money. It was not designed to. It was designed to give people who had lost everything a place to learn a skill and a place to sleep while they learned it. "I didn't send you out to punish you," Howard said. He looked at all 3 of them. "I sent you out to see whether any of you could see what I've been seeing." He let that stand. Then he asked each of them the same question in the same voice. "If I gave you this lot, what would you build?" Connor answered first. He talked about hiring a project manager, engaging a general contractor, fast-tracking the permit process, an estimated 6-month timeline if approvals moved efficiently. It was technically sound. It had process and sequence and a realistic endpoint. Connor heard it leaving his mouth and heard exactly what it lacked, and he stopped before he finished. He looked at the cracked concrete under his feet, at the weeds coming up through it, at the distance between a capable answer and a living one. He did not try to fill the space with more words. Howard looked at his eldest son at the stillness in him that hadn't been there a week ago and said nothing. But he registered it. Brett was looking past his father when his turn came, looking toward the back of the lot, toward the low-rise buildings visible over the fence line, and the clothesline strung between two power poles, with work shirts moving slowly in the wind. He said quietly, almost to himself, "There should be laundry in the building. People always need clean clothes." It was not a sentence about square footage or return on investment. It was a sentence about what people actually needed when they came home after a long shift with nothing comfortable waiting for them. Margaret Holt had not taught him this with words. She had taught it by opening her doors at 6 in the morning for 35 years and writing a stranger's address on a scrap of paper without asking for anything in return. Howard felt something shift in him at that sentence, the way things shift when you have been waiting a long time for a particular kind of evidence, and it finally arrives in a form you didn't expect. He had not anticipated Brett. Of the three, Brett had seemed furthest from any of this, most insulated by his own performance of himself, most committed to the version of ambition that was really just avoidance, dressed up in the language of enterprise. And yet here he stood at a chain-link fence in Rainier Valley, looking at a clothesline, thinking about clean clothes. Leo walked through a gap in the fence without asking. He moved around the perimeter of the lot, slowly the way you move when you're listening to a space, rather than measuring it. He stopped at the corner, where the broken brick wall met the cracked concrete, crouched down, and placed his palm flat on the ground, on the cold concrete, and the weeds pushing through it, and held it there. Then he stood, opened his notebook, and drew. When he brought the notebook back to his father, the ground floor was sketched in 3 distinct sections: electrical, carpentry, plumbing. Beside the carpentry section, in the same careful handwriting that had recorded every cent over 7 days, was a note: Arthur Webb, lead instructor. Currently at transitional shelter on Rainier Avenue South most evenings. Not a concept, not a proposed profile for a potential hire. A specific man with a specific name at a specific address, already placed inside the building like a load-bearing element, as though the structure could not stand correctly without him. Howard looked at the name for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the particular evenness of a person who has waited months to hear something and is now working to receive it without letting the waiting show. "You didn't just survive the week," he said. "You saw somebody." Leo said, "He saw me first." 5 words. Howard read them the way he read everything that mattered, slowly and more than once, until the full weight of them settled. He stood in the weeds and the wind at the edge of that lot in Rainier Valley, and understood for the first time since he had planned this week that what he had hoped to find was exactly what he had found. Not in the way he had imagined, not clean, not simple, not without the particular sadness of seeing a 27-year-old man stop mid-sentence and look at his own shoes. But real. The real kind, which is never without cost. The workshop on the ground floor opened on a Tuesday morning in September. There was no ceremony. Arthur Webb arrived before anyone else, the way he arrived at everything early, because the work was worth being early for. He unlocked the door with a key that had his name on the tag, the first key with his name on it in more than 2 years. He turned on the lights. The room smelled like sawdust and linseed oil and the particular readiness of a space built for a purpose and about to meet it. 4 other men worked in the shop that first week. One had been a mechanic, one had never held a hammer. Arthur taught the way he built things slowly without wasted motion, with the understanding that how you measured was as important as what you made. He would place his hand over a student's hand and adjust the angle without speaking, then step back and say, "Now read it." Every piece of furniture that left the workshop had 2 letters carved into the underside. Connor returned to Caldwell Property Group, but not to the same version of the role. He proposed to his father, not to the board, a free advisory program for small businesses in Rainier Valley, and accepted a partial reduction in his own compensation to fund the initial operating costs. He still wore Oxford shoes. He walked to meetings now sometimes 10 blocks or more, and his feet had learned the city's distances in the particular way feet learn things when they have no other choice. Brett spent 3 days a week at Holt's Alterations and Laundry. Margaret's knees had been getting worse since August. She did not say so, but he watched the way she moved from the counter to the machines and understood without being told. He opened at 6 on the days he was there. The other 2 days he spent at the workshop in Rainier Valley, managing the materials budget and coordinating supply orders. When people asked what he did, he said, "I help people get what they need." The sentence fit well enough that he stopped feeling the need to say anything more. Leo rented an apartment 4 blocks from the workshop. The black notebook from the week of $50 was full by October. A second one lived in the drawer of his small desk, beside the gold pocket watch, scratched case, fogged crystal still not running, which his father had placed in his hand the morning after the Rainier Valley visit without ceremony. Leo kept it the way you keep things that are not about the object itself, but about the moment that made the object matter. Arthur Webb had a room on the 3rd floor with a window that faced east. On his shelf, a photograph of Sandra taken in the kitchen of the Tacoma house before she got sick. Beside it, the small poplar box with the sliding lid and AW carved into the bottom. Inside the box, coiled neatly, was the worn leather strap from his old tool belt. He kept it as evidence not of loss, but of return. A record of the morning he found himself again, and wanted to remember what that felt like. On a September afternoon, Howard sat in the study of the Medina house. The light came through the west window, the way it does in Seattle in early fall. Slow and golden, unhurried, the kind of light that doesn't push. He opened the narrow top drawer of Walter Caldwell's old desk. Empty. He did not feel the absence as loss. He felt it as a particular kind of relief, the specific lightness of a person who has carried something for 40 years and finally set it down somewhere it belongs. He had built a company worth $1.4 billion from nothing in the way people build things when they understand at the cellular level what nothing feels like and are determined not to return to it. He would keep building. But what he was building now could not be measured in quarterly reports, or appraised by analysts, or engraved in metal letters above a glass entrance. It was measured in a man who had a key with his name on it, and arrived early because the work was worth it. It was measured in a son who asked instead of announced. It was measured in 5 words, said on a gray morning at a chain-link fence. Howard closed the drawer. Outside the window, Seattle spread wide across the water, and the hills lit from the west, moving at its own pace, full of people carrying things that no one else could see. For the first time in a very long time, Howard Caldwell looked at it without counting. The next morning, before anyone arrived, Arthur Webb stood alone in the workshop. The lights were off. The room held the smell of the previous day's work, milled wood and oil, and something without a name that meant useful things were made here. On the bench in front of him was a small oak side table he had built over the past week. He had taken no shortcuts. He had let each joint set fully before moving to the next. He ran his palm across the surface, smooth and even, the grain showing through the finish, like the wood was simply being what it was. He turned the table over, reached behind his ear, took out the pencil, pressed the tip into the soft underside, and wrote 2 letters with the same care he gave every measurement. A W. He turned the table right side up, looked at it for a moment. Then he reached over and turned on the light, walked to the door, opened it, and the morning came in.